Psychosocial hazards are a big issue across Australia and New Zealand, but we do see a little bit of nuance within the public sector because the pressures are a little bit different. When we start to talk about change specifically in the public sector, we know that because of the level of bureaucracy, processes around change tend to be a little more slower moving. We also have a different intersection of pressures, so there can be changing priorities from ministers, there can be political pressures external to the organisation, which mean that the goalposts move a little more regularly than in the private sector, for example. Other psychosocial hazards specifically are also a little bit different. For example, customer aggression. Because for most public sector, the customer is actually the citizen, responding to that level of aggression is much more complex than in the private sector and much more complex to navigate a solution for as well. For this reason, we find that public sector is struggling a little bit with meaningfully engaging with psychosocial hazards and constructing frameworks that will work. We see 5 top hazards within this sector, and we're going to talk through a few solutions for them today. The first hazard is workload. Across jurisdictions, we are seeing organisations being asked to do more with less, and this is happening at the same time as our workloads and ways of working are fundamentally changing as we see digital products come in and disrupt the way we do what we do. This is something which is incredibly difficult to manage in any circumstance, but in public sector we see it have a greater impact because of some of the barriers to change. The next hazard is low autonomy. In private sector, oftentimes we would look at lowering some psychosocial hazards by increasing the level of engagement and autonomy that people have in their tasks. This isn't always possible in the public sector because there are such defined ways of doing things within a probity context and often directions coming from multiple agencies or multiple sources. It is not that easy for workers to actually be able to be autonomous in their work or to have a high degree of agency in how they go about their work. And this can give rise to quite a complex hazard. Another hazard is role conflict. We often see this in public sector where there are either conflicts between the remits of particular roles which cause tension, or there's conflict within a role itself where you have different priorities being pushed from different sources. So maybe from a different agency, sometimes from a minister themselves, sometimes from other stakeholders. And what this does is this creates tension and friction within people's roles, so they become confused about where to expend their energy, how to add value, and this can be experienced as very stressful. Traumatic materials are often present across the public sector and sometimes in surprising ways. Obviously, we understand in areas such as court services or criminal and justice systems that there will inherently be traumatic materials. However, we also see it in organisations that have archiving at play, who have exposure to different data where it can be quite traumatic, but you don't know whether that particular piece of data is going to be traumatic. And it's that uncertainty that actually gives rise to the hazard. This is quite a tricky hazard because it's inherent to the work that is done. It's quite tricky to actually control it, and it's something that can have really devastating effects on your workforce. And lastly, public aggression is something which we see across a range of contexts within the public sector. And it's really complex to actually navigate. You have a mix of really high stakes departments where you have a very meaningful impact on the citizen or the stakeholder. It can be very tricky to control public aggression as a hazard within an organisation, and we often see that it's actually the anticipation of the aggression rather than the aggression itself which is giving rise to the most damage, and this can be a very difficult thing to manage within a workflow. These are the 5 hazards which we most commonly see at play in the public sector. They are tricky, they are nuanced for your context as well. But I want to give you 3 easy tips that you can implement today to lower the impact of some of these hazards. If you map the psychosocial hazards across your workflows, this will give you much greater understanding of actually where these risks are coming from. It sounds like a simple thing, but often we just go to our risk registers, list them out, put generic controls on them, but we don't actually consider where they are within a workflow. It's where they are in the workflow that's the access to the control, because that's how you understand how they intersect. Secondly, I would recommend that you look at redesigning just one element of the way that you work. Usually when we start to talk about work redesign, we look at the whole organisation or the whole network map. And then suddenly you have an 18-month project, or in certain departments maybe a 5-year project. And this can be too overwhelming, and by the time the change comes through, the root reason has passed. If you break it down and just make it simple, what is one thing in the way that you do things that you can change, which is going to either reduce or eliminate one of these hazards? And finally, if you build a support network and escalation structure which allows your workforces to more proactively engage in the hazards, even if the process itself can't change, you will see people have a higher level of resilience to the hazards themselves. This can be really simple things, from having a buddy structure or working groups which don't require any approvals or process changes, but having that way to actually engage with the hazards in a dynamic way, albeit within an organism that can be quite slow moving, will really lower the impacts of the hazards that you're not able to eliminate. Psychosocial hazards in the public sector are at times tricky, they're complex, they're nuanced, but when you start small with interventions that can have huge impact, that is when you have the most uplift with your workforce.